The days after that night passed in a blur, but each one felt heavier than the last. I went through the motions pretending that everything was normal, but I could feel the lie growing inside me like a poison. Every time Mark smiled at me, every time he held my hand or kissed me goodnight, it was like a knife twisting in my gut. I couldn't look him in the eye without feeling the weight of what I had done bearing down on me, suffocating me. I told myself it was just a mistake, a slip, that I could move past it, that no one had to know. But the guilt was relentless. It clung to me, whispered in my ear every waking moment, even in my dreams. I couldn't escape it. Mark was oblivious, of course. He had no reason to suspect anything. We were still intimate, still laughed together, still had our little moments of comfort and routine. But I felt disconnected from all of it. Like I was watching my own life from a distance, through a thick, distorted glass. There were times when I'd catch him looking at me, and I'd wonder if he could see it on my face, if he could sense that something was wrong. But if he did, he never said anything. About a week after it happened, Jake texted me again. A simple message. "How are you?" That was all. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, my heart racing. I had deleted his number after that night, thinking it would help me cut ties, but the text still came. I knew I shouldn't respond. I should have ignored it, erased it, pretended like it never happened. But instead I texted back, "I'm fine." It was a lie. I wasn't fine. I was a mess, barely holding it together. But somehow, seeing his name on my phone again stirred something inside me. Confusion, guilt, shame, and a flicker of something else. Something dangerous. Jake replied quickly, "I've been thinking about you." I felt my stomach drop. I didn't know what to say to that. My mind screamed at me to stop, to end this, but I found myself typing, "We shouldn't talk anymore." His response came almost immediately. "I know, but I can't stop thinking about that night. Can you?" I closed my eyes, my hands trembling as I held the phone. Of course I had been thinking about that night. It haunted me, but it wasn't just the guilt that stayed with me. It was the way he made me feel. For that brief, reckless moment, I had felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Passion, excitement, desire. Things that had faded into the background of my marriage without me even realizing it. I didn't respond to Jake's message. I couldn't. But his words lingered in my mind, twisting my thoughts. As much as I wanted to forget that night, I couldn't. It had left a mark on me, one I didn't know how to erase. A few days later, Mark and I went to dinner with some friends, the usual crowd we'd known for years. It was a casual evening, good food, wine, laughter. But the entire time I felt disconnected, like I was playing a part in a play I no longer belonged in. I watched Mark laugh with his friends, watched the way he casually touched my arm, the way he looked at me with such ease, such love, and all I could think about was how much I didn't deserve any of it. The guilt was suffocating, but I couldn't talk to anyone about it. Who could I tell? Who would understand? So I bottled it up, pushed it down, and tried to convince myself that I could keep it buried forever. But then I saw Jake again. It was completely unexpected. I was at the grocery store, mindlessly pushing my cart through the aisles when I turned the corner, and there he was. He looked just as startled as I was, but then he smiled, that same easy, familiar smile that had once been nothing more than friendly, but now felt loaded with something else. "Hey," he said, his voice casual, like we were just old friends running into each other. "Hi," I managed to say, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, the way my body tensed at the sight of him. We stood there for a moment, awkwardly blocking the aisle, neither of us knowing what to say. I wanted to run, to get away from him, but I was rooted to the spot. "How've you been?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. "Fine," I lied again, forcing a smile. "You?" "Same," he said, though his tone told me otherwise. There was a long pause, the air between us thick with unspoken words. Finally he took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you," he said, his eyes intense, locking onto mine. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. "Jake, we can't." "I know," he interrupted, his voice soft but insistent. "But it happened, and I can't pretend it didn't." I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm married. You know that." "I'm not asking you to leave him," Jake said, his expression serious. "But can you honestly say you haven't thought about that night? That you don't feel something between us." His words sent a shiver down my spine because they were the same thoughts that had been plaguing me since that night. I couldn't lie to myself anymore. I had felt something with Jake, something I hadn't felt in a long time. But that didn't mean it was right. "I can't do this," I whispered, my voice breaking. "It was a mistake." Jake looked at me for a long time, his face unreadable. Then he nodded slowly, stepping back. "Okay. If that's what you want." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was what I wanted. It was what I needed. I couldn't let this go any further. I couldn't destroy my marriage, destroy Mark, over something that should have never happened in the first place. Jake gave me a small, sad smile, then turned and walked away, disappearing down the aisle without another word. I stood there for a long time after he left, my heart racing, my mind spinning. I knew I had made the right choice, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like I was losing something. Something I hadn't realized I was missing until it was right in front of me. I went home that day determined to put it behind me, to focus on Mark, on our marriage, on the life we had built together. But it wasn't that simple. Jake's words echoed in my mind, and the feelings he had stirred in me refused to fade away. I tried to throw myself into my marriage, to reignite the spark that had dimmed over the years. I planned dates, initiated more intimacy, did everything I could to reconnect with Mark. And for a while it seemed to work. We were closer, more affectionate, more in tune with each other than we had been in years. But no matter how hard I tried, there was always a part of me that was still thinking about Jake. About what had happened between us, about what could have been if things were different. It was a shadow that followed me everywhere, a constant reminder of the mistake I had made. Weeks passed, and life resumed its steady, familiar rhythm. Mark and I settled back into our routine, and for all intents and purposes everything seemed fine. On the surface, at least. We went to work, came home, cooked dinner together, and spent our weekends with friends or curled up on the couch watching TV. But there was always that gnawing feeling inside me. Something unresolved, unfinished. I thought about Jake far more than I should have. I hated myself for it, but it was like I couldn't help it. There was this magnetic pull toward him. Something I had never experienced with anyone else, not even Mark. And the worst part was I didn't even fully understand it. Was it just the thrill of something forbidden? The excitement of someone new? Or was it something deeper? I didn't know, and that uncertainty ate away at me. Mark was still as oblivious as ever. In a way, I envied him for it, for the simplicity of his life compared to the mess inside my head. He was happy, or at least he seemed to be. And I had promised myself that I wouldn't hurt him again, that I'd never let things with Jake cross the line. But promises are fragile things, easily broken when temptation lingers too close for too long. It was about a month after I'd run into Jake at the grocery store that I got another message from him. This time there were no questions, no small talk. It was just one line, but it was enough to send my heart racing all over again. "I miss you." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling as I read those 3 words over and over. I had tried so hard to forget, to move on, to push Jake out of my mind, but with that one message everything came flooding back. The kiss, the hotel room, the way he had looked at me, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to be strong, to do the right thing. But the truth was I missed him too. And that realization scared me more than anything. It wasn't just a fleeting attraction anymore. It was something deeper, something I couldn't quite explain. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and all it would take was one more step to send me tumbling over. But instead of replying, I threw my phone onto the bed, pacing the room in a panic. What was I doing? I had a husband, a life, a marriage that I had worked so hard to build. And here I was risking it all for what? For a man who wasn't mine? For a moment of excitement that would eventually fade like all the others? I tried to shake it off, to push the thoughts of Jake out of my mind. But that night, when Mark was sound asleep beside me, I found myself reaching for my phone, my fingers hovering over Jake's message. I shouldn't have replied. I knew that. But the silence in the room was deafening, and the weight of my own thoughts felt unbearable. "I miss you too," I typed, my heart pounding as I hit send. I immediately regretted it. My stomach twisted in knots, and I could barely breathe as I stared at the screen, waiting for his response. Part of me hoped he wouldn't reply, that he'd let it go, that this would be the end of it. But deep down I knew better. It didn't take long for the notification to pop up. Can I see you? I closed my eyes, my chest tightening as I read the words. I had to say no. I had to end this now, before it went any further. But instead of saying no, I found myself typing back. When? The days leading up to seeing Jake again were a blur. I was restless, distracted, a mess of nerves and guilt. Mark noticed, of course, but I blamed it on work, on stress, on anything but the real reason. I hated myself for lying, for sneaking around behind his back. But the pull toward Jake was too strong, too intoxicating to resist. We agreed to meet in a quiet part of town, away from prying eyes, at a small cafe where no one would recognize us. I told myself it was just to talk, to clear the air, to put everything behind us once and for all. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. When I arrived, Jake was already there, sitting at a table by the window. He looked up when I walked in, and for a moment I hesitated. I could still turn around, walk away, and end this before it started. But then our eyes met, and the familiar pull was there again, stronger than ever. "Hey," he said softly as I sat down across from him. "Hey," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a tension between us, thick and palpable. We exchanged small talk at first, awkwardly dancing around the real reason we were there. But it didn't take long for the conversation to shift. "I can't stop thinking about you," Jake admitted, his eyes locking onto mine. "About that night." I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. "Jake, this has to stop. I'm married. We can't keep doing this." "I know you're married," he said, his voice low and intense. "But that doesn't change how I feel about you. And I don't think it changes how you feel either." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down I knew he was right. No matter how much I wanted to deny it, there was something between us. Something I couldn't ignore. "I don't know what to do," I whispered, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "I love Mark. But I don't know how to stop." Jake reached across the table, taking my hand in his. His touch sent a jolt through me. A mix of comfort and longing that made my heart ache. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said gently. "We can figure this out together." But I knew it wasn't that simple. There was no easy answer, no way to have it both ways. I was standing at a crossroads, and no matter which path I chose, someone would get hurt. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to face that. We sat in silence for a while, his hand still holding mine, the weight of everything pressing down on us. Finally I pulled away, standing up from the table. "I can't do this," I said, my voice shaky. "I'm sorry, Jake, but I can't." Jake looked up at me, his expression pained but understanding. "If that's what you want." I nodded, though my heart screamed at me to stay. But I couldn't. I had to go home, back to Mark, back to the life I had built. Even if it wasn't perfect, even if it lacked the thrill and excitement I had found with Jake, it was real. It was solid. And I couldn't throw that away for something that might never last. As I walked out of the cafe, I didn't look back. But the weight in my chest was heavier than ever, and I knew this wasn't over. Not really. Because no matter how much I tried to bury it, the feelings I had for Jake weren't going to disappear overnight. They would linger like a shadow, always there, just beneath the surface. And as much as I wanted to believe I had made the right choice, part of me wondered if I had just made the biggest mistake of all. The days after I walked out of that cafe felt like I was living in slow motion, dragging myself through the motions of life while my mind spun with everything that had happened. I went home to Mark, kissed him like I always did, smiled when he asked how my day had been, and pretended that everything was normal. But nothing was normal anymore. Not inside me. I thought about Jake constantly. Every time I woke up in the middle of the night, my thoughts drifted to him. Every quiet moment, every drive to work, every mindless task, he was there haunting me. I couldn't shake the memory of that last conversation, the look in his eyes when I told him I couldn't do this. It wasn't just the guilt of what I'd already done with him. It was the lingering question of what if? What if I had stayed that day? What if I had let things unfold with him the way my heart wanted them to? But I couldn't. I had to keep telling myself that. I had a husband, a life, a future that I had chosen. Mark was a good man, a kind man, the type of man I had always imagined building a life with. And yet, there was this gnawing emptiness inside me, a quiet ache that only grew louder every time I thought about Jake. One night, about 2 weeks after that last meeting, Mark and I were sitting on the couch watching some random show, his arm draped over my shoulders. I felt his warmth, his familiar presence beside me, but it felt distant, like there was a wall between us that I couldn't quite see but could definitely feel. I looked over at him, at his profile lit by the glow of the TV, and my heart ached with guilt. I couldn't keep lying to him. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when inside I was drowning in secrets. I opened my mouth trying to find the words, trying to explain what I was feeling, but they wouldn't come. How could I possibly tell him that I had cheated? That I had fallen for another man? How could I shatter his world like that? Mark must have noticed something was off, because he muted the TV and turned to me, concern in his eyes. "Hey," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. "You've been quiet lately. Is everything okay?" The lump in my throat swelled and I fought back tears. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to spill everything, to finally let the truth out and deal with the consequences, whatever they might be. But when I looked into his eyes, all I saw was the love he had for me, the trust. How could I destroy that? "I'm fine," I whispered, the lie bitter on my tongue. Mark didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press. He just pulled me closer, kissed the top of my head, and turned the TV back on. And I let him. I let him believe that everything was okay, that I was okay, because the alternative was too terrifying to even consider. But that night, after Mark fell asleep, I lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The guilt was eating me alive. I couldn't go on like this. Something had to change. Either I had to let Jake go completely and fully commit to Mark, or I didn't even want to think about the other option. The next day, I woke up feeling more exhausted than ever. I dragged myself through the morning routine, barely registering anything around me as I got dressed for work. Mark had already left early for a meeting, and the silence of the house felt suffocating. I made a cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and stared blankly at my phone, as if willing it to give me some kind of answer. That's when I saw it. Another message from Jake. My heart lurched in my chest as I opened it, my hands shaking. "I know you said we can't do this, but I can't stop thinking about you. Please just meet me one last time. I need to see you." I felt the pull again, the same pull I'd felt since the beginning. It was like gravity tugging me toward him, no matter how hard I tried to resist. I knew I should delete the message, block his number, and never look back. But instead, I found myself typing a response, my fingers moving as if they had a mind of their own. The moment I sent that message, I felt a surge of panic, like I had just set something in motion that I couldn't stop. I stared at my phone, waiting for Jake's reply, my heart pounding in my chest. When the notification popped up, I barely breathed as I opened it. "Tonight. Same place." I stared at those words for a long time, my mind racing. What was I doing? Why was I doing this? I had told myself I was done, that I couldn't keep going down this road. But here I was, agreeing to see him again, knowing full well that it could only lead to more trouble. I tried to justify it to myself, telling myself that it was just one last time. One final meeting to say goodbye, to put everything behind us for good. But deep down I knew that wasn't the truth. I was lying to myself just like I had been lying to Mark. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't concentrate at work, couldn't focus on anything except the thought of seeing Jake again. My mind was a mess of nerves and excitement, guilt and anticipation. I kept checking my phone, counting down the hours until I would see him. By the time the end of the workday rolled around, I was a bundle of anxiety. I drove home in a daze, barely aware of the traffic around me. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw that Mark's car wasn't there. He was working late again. A small part of me felt relieved. I wouldn't have to face him before going to meet Jake. I wasn't sure I could handle the guilt if I did. I changed quickly, opting for something casual, something that wouldn't raise suspicion if Mark happened to see me before I left. I told myself it was just another night out, nothing unusual, nothing to feel guilty about. But as I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my clothes, I could feel the weight of my own deception pressing down on me. I left the house without leaving a note, without telling Mark where I was going. He didn't ask and I didn't offer any explanations. I just drove, my heart pounding with every mile, my mind racing with what was about to happen. When I pulled up to the cafe, Jake was already there, sitting at the same table by the window where we had met before. He looked up as I walked in, his expression a mix of relief and something else, Something more intense, more charged. The moment I saw him, I knew this wasn't just about saying goodbye. There was too much between us, too much that hadn't been said, too much that couldn't be undone. We didn't speak right away. I sat down across from him, my hands trembling slightly as I placed them in my lap. Jake watched me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine, and then he finally spoke. "I didn't think you'd come," he said quietly, his voice low and filled with emotion. "I shouldn't have," I whispered, my throat tight. "But you did," he said, his gaze never leaving mine. "Why?" I swallowed hard, struggling to find the words. I wanted to tell him that I didn't know, that I was confused, that I didn't understand why I was here. But the truth was, I knew exactly why. I was here because I couldn't stay away. Because despite everything, despite Mark, despite the guilt, I couldn't stop wanting Jake. "I don't know," I lied, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake reached across the table, his fingers brushing mine, sending a shiver through me. "You do know," he said softly. "You feel it too, don't you?" I looked down at our hands, at the way his touch made my heart race, and I knew I couldn't lie anymore. Not to him. Not to myself. "Yes," I whispered, the word slipping out before I could stop it. Jake stood up then, his hand still holding mine, and I followed him, my heart pounding in my chest. We left the cafe together, the air between us electric with tension, with everything we had been holding back for so long. We didn't speak as we walked, the silence heavy with anticipation. I didn't ask where we were going, and Jake didn't say. I just followed him, knowing that whatever happened next, there was no turning back. We ended up at his car, parked a few blocks away. Jake opened the door for me, and I slid inside, my hands shaking as I buckled the seatbelt. He got in next to me, starting the engine, but neither of us said a word. The drive was short, but it felt like an eternity, the silence between us thick with unspoken emotions. When we arrived at his hotel, my heart was racing so fast I thought it might explode. Jake parked the car, and we sat there for a moment, neither of us moving, neither of us speaking. I could feel the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on me. But at the same time, there was this undeniable pull, this deep, aching desire that I couldn't ignore. Jake turned to me then, his eyes dark and intense. "We don't have to do this," he said quietly, though his voice was strained with the same longing that I felt. But we both knew that we did. We had crossed too many lines already. There was no going back. I nodded, barely able to breathe, and without another word, we got out of the car and walked into the hotel together. The hotel lobby was quiet, almost eerily so. The dim lighting and the soft murmur of distant conversations only heightened the tension that buzzed between us. My heart was racing, each beat echoing in my chest like a drum as I followed Jake across the polished floor. I knew where this was going, what was about to happen, and every step I took felt like I was crossing another line, farther and farther away from the life I had known with Mark. When we reached the elevator, Jake pressed the button without saying a word. We stood there side by side, the silence thick and heavy. I could feel the heat of his body next to mine, the electricity in the air between us. It was like every nerve in my body was on high alert. And yet I felt numb, as if I was floating outside of myself, watching everything unfold from a distance. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and we stepped inside. The ride up was agonizingly slow, each second dragging out as we stood in that confined space, neither of us speaking, both of us knowing what was coming. I couldn't bring myself to look at him, afraid of what I might see in his eyes, or worse, what he might see in mine. When the doors finally slid open on his floor, Jake led the way down a quiet hallway, the carpet muffling our footsteps. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. He stopped in front of a door, pulled out his keycard and opened it, stepping aside to let me in first. The room was simple, like any standard hotel room, king-sized bed, a desk, a TV mounted on the wall. But to me it felt like something much more. It felt like the point of no return. I stood there for a moment, just inside the doorway, my hands trembling at my sides. I knew what I was about to do, knew the consequences, knew that once I crossed this line, there would be no taking it back. The guilt was already suffocating me, but it was tangled up with something else, desire, longing, need. Emotions I hadn't allowed myself to feel for so long. Jake closed the door behind us, and the sound of the lock clicking into place sent a shiver down my spine. He didn't say anything as he came up behind me, his hand brushing lightly against my arm. I closed my eyes at the contact, every inch of my skin suddenly alive with sensation. His touch was gentle at first, hesitant, as if he was giving me one last chance to stop this, to walk away. But I didn't. Instead, I turned around slowly to face him, my breath catching in my throat as our eyes met. The look in his eyes was intense, filled with the same emotions that were swirling inside me. Desire, guilt, anticipation, and something deeper, something I didn't dare name. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly, his voice rough with emotion. I swallowed hard, my throat tight, but I nodded. I wasn't sure of anything, but in that moment it didn't matter. All that mattered was the way he was looking at me, the way my body was responding to him, the way my heart was racing with a mixture of fear and excitement. Jake didn't need any more confirmation. He stepped closer, his hand reaching up to cup my face, his thumb brushing gently across my cheek. His touch was warm, familiar, and yet it sent a shockwave through me, igniting something deep inside. I felt my breath hitch as he leaned in, his lips hovering just inches from mine. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The world outside the hotel room faded away, and all I could think about was Jake, his presence, his touch, the overwhelming need I felt for him. And then, before I could second-guess myself, I closed the distance between us. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if we were both testing the waters, trying to gauge the depth of the emotions that had brought us to this point. But it didn't stay soft for long. The moment our lips met, something inside me snapped. All the guilt, the confusion, the fear. It melted away, replaced by a burning need that I couldn't control. I kissed him harder, my hands gripping his shirt as I pulled him closer. Jake responded in kind, his arms wrapping around me, holding me tightly against him. The kiss deepened, became more urgent, more desperate, as if we were both trying to make up for all the time we had spent denying this. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me even closer, and I could feel the heat of his body against mine, the hard lines of his chest pressing into me. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps as the intensity of the moment consumed me. I knew I was teetering on the edge of something dangerous, something that could destroy everything I had built with Mark. But in that moment I didn't care. All I cared about was Jake, the way he made me feel, the way he was kissing me like I was the only thing that mattered in the world. I barely registered the moment we moved toward the bed, my body responding to his touch in ways I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Jake's hands roamed over my body, exploring, teasing, and I felt a rush of heat flood through me. Every touch, every kiss was a reminder of how alive I felt with him, how much I had missed this feeling of being desired, wanted. But even as my body craved more, my mind was screaming at me to stop. This wasn't just a kiss. This wasn't just an innocent flirtation anymore. I was on the verge of making a decision that would change everything. My marriage, my future, my entire life. And for what? For a moment of passion. A fleeting escape from the routine of my life? As Jake's hand slipped beneath my shirt, I froze, the weight of the situation crashing down on me all at once. My heart pounded in my chest, but this time it wasn't from desire. It was from fear. What was I doing? How had I let it get this far? I pulled back suddenly, breaking the kiss, my breath ragged as I took a step away from him. Jake looked at me, his eyes filled with confusion and concern. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I couldn't speak at first. My throat was tight, my mind racing. I wanted to tell him that I couldn't do this, that I had to leave, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stood there, my chest heaving as I tried to make sense of the storm of emotion swirling inside me. Jake stepped closer, reaching for me, but I shook my head, stepping back again. "I can't," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I can't do this." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly, his hand dropping to his side. "I understand," he said quietly, though there was a deep sadness in his voice. I didn't know what to say. The guilt was crashing over me in waves, and all I wanted to do was run. But part of me also wanted to stay, to give in to the feelings I had been suppressing for so long. It was a war between my heart and my conscience, and I felt like I was being torn in two. Jake didn't push me. He didn't say anything else, just stood there waiting, giving me the space to decide what to do. And as I stood there staring at him, the weight of my decision pressed down on me. I had already crossed so many lines. I had already betrayed Mark, not just physically but emotionally. But crossing this final line, that would change everything. There would be no going back. No more pretending. No more lying. It would destroy the life I had with Mark. And even though things with Jake felt intoxicating, exciting, I wasn't sure I was ready to give up everything for it. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Jake looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of disappointment and understanding. He took a step back, giving me space, and nodded. "Don't be," he said softly. "You don't have to apologize." But I did. I had to apologize to him, to Mark, to myself, for letting it get this far, for allowing myself to be torn between two lives, two men, for not being strong enough to stop it sooner. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, my heart breaking with every step. I didn't look back, didn't allow myself to hesitate. I had to get out of there. I had to leave before I made a mistake I couldn't undo. The cool night air hit me as I stepped outside, and I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm the storm raging inside me. My hands were shaking, my mind spinning, and all I wanted to do was disappear. I got into my car and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, my chest heaving with the weight of what had almost happened. I had come so close, too close, to crossing the line completely. And now I had to live with the consequences of everything that had already happened. As I drove home, my thoughts were a tangled mess of guilt, shame, and regret. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to face Mark, how to move forward from this. All I knew was that my life had changed in ways I couldn't begin to understand. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark, and a wave of relief washed over me. Mark wasn't home yet. I sat there in the silence of my car, the engine still humming softly as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. My thoughts were in complete disarray. The weight of what had almost happened, of everything I had already done, bore down on me, suffocating me. I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, the cool night air hitting my face, but it did nothing to clear my mind. My legs felt weak as I walked up to the front door, my hand trembling as I unlocked it. The moment I stepped inside, I was greeted by the familiar smell of home, the faint scent of Mark's cologne lingering in the air. It was a smell I had always found comforting, but tonight, it only made the knot in my stomach tighten. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, pressing my forehead to the cool wood as I tried to gather my thoughts. What had I done? How had I let things get this far? The guilt gnawed at me, relentless and unforgiving, and I felt like I was drowning in it. I couldn't pretend anymore. Not to Mark. Not to myself. I had crossed lines I never thought I would, and now I was paying the price. But the worst part was I wasn't even sure how to fix it. How do you fix something that's already broken? How do you go back to the life you had before when you've already betrayed the person you love? I needed to talk to Mark. I needed to tell him the truth, no matter how much it would hurt him, no matter how much it would shatter everything we had built together. But the thought of confessing made my chest tighten with fear. What if he left me? What if he couldn't forgive me? The life we had built together, our home, our marriage, it would all come crumbling down, and it would be my fault. I moved through the house like a ghost, my body on autopilot, as I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. I took a sip, but my throat was so tight I could barely swallow. The silence in the house was oppressive, and the ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to echo louder and louder with every second that passed. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from me where Mark usually sat. My mind drifted back to all the mornings we had shared here, sipping coffee together before heading off to work. All the evenings we spent talking about our day, laughing over silly things, planning our future together. It seemed like a lifetime ago, before everything had changed. I couldn't stop thinking about Jake. The way his eyes had looked at me tonight. The way his touch had ignited something inside me that I hadn't felt in so long. But no matter how intoxicating it had been, it wasn't real. Not in the way my life with Mark was real. Jake had been an escape, a moment of passion that had blinded me to what truly mattered. And now I was paying the price for it. Just as I was lost in thought, I heard the sound of the front door opening. My heart leaped into my throat, and I froze, gripping the edge of the table as Mark's footsteps echoed through the hallway. I hadn't even heard his car pull into the driveway. My pulse quickened, panic rising in my chest. I wasn't ready to face him. Not yet. But there was no escaping it now. Mark appeared in the doorway, looking exhausted but smiling when he saw me. "Hey," he said softly, dropping his keys on the counter. "You're up late." I forced a smile, though it felt hollow like a mask I was barely managing to keep in place. "Yeah," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "I couldn't sleep." He came over and leaned down to kiss me on the forehead, his touch so familiar, so warm. But I felt like I was miles away from him, separated by a wall of lies that I had built brick by brick. "How was work?" I asked, trying to sound casual, trying to keep the conversation from veering into dangerous territory. Mark sighed as he sat down across from me, rubbing his temples. "Long. Just a lot of back-to-back meetings. I feel like I barely had time to breathe today." I nodded, staring down at the table. The guilt was suffocating, wrapping around my throat like a noose. He had no idea. No idea what I had done. No idea that the woman sitting across from him had betrayed him in the worst possible way. "I missed you," Mark said, his voice gentle. "It's been a crazy week. I feel like we haven't had much time together lately." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. How could he be so kind, so loving, when I had been so cruel? I wanted to tell him everything right then and there, to lay it all out in the open and beg for his forgiveness. But I couldn't. The words were stuck in my throat, buried beneath layers of fear and shame. "I missed you too," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Mark reached across the table and took my hand in his thumb gently stroking my skin. His touch was so familiar, so comforting, but all I could think about was how much I didn't deserve it. I had ruined everything, and he didn't even know it. "Are you okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing with concern. "You've been a little distant lately." My heart clenched in my chest, and I forced myself to meet his eyes. The concern in his gaze, the love, it was too much. I felt like I was going to break under the weight of it all. "I'm fine." I lied again, the words bitter on my tongue. "Just tired, I guess." Mark studied me for a long moment, as if he could sense that something was wrong but didn't know what. I held my breath, praying that he wouldn't push any further, that he wouldn't ask the questions I wasn't ready to answer. After what felt like an eternity, he finally nodded. "Okay," he said softly. "But if something's bothering you, you know you can talk to me, right?" The tears I had been holding back finally spilled over, and I quickly wiped them away, hoping he wouldn't notice. But of course he did. He always did. "Hey," Mark said, his voice filled with concern as he stood up and came around to my side of the table. He knelt down beside me, gently turning my face toward him. "What's wrong? Why are you crying?" I couldn't hold it in anymore. The guilt, the shame, the weight of everything I had done. It was crushing me, and I couldn't bear it alone any longer. "I'm so sorry," I choked out, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Mark." Mark's expression shifted, confusion flickering in his eyes.
"Sorry?
For what?" I shook my head, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I made a mistake. A huge mistake. My voice faltered, and I felt my chest tighten as I struggled to find the courage to continue. Mark's brow furrowed, and he took my hands in his grip firm but gentle. "What mistake? What are you talking about?" I squeezed my eyes shut, the tears streaming down my cheeks as I whispered the words I had been dreading. "I cheated, Mark. I cheated on you." The silence that followed was deafening. It hung in the air like a heavy weight, pressing down on both of us. I could feel Mark's hands go still in mine, his grip loosening as the shock of my confession registered. For a moment he didn't say anything. He just knelt there staring at me, his face unreadable. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest I thought it might burst, and I couldn't breathe. The silence stretched on, each second more unbearable than the last. Finally Mark stood up, letting go of my hands as he took a step back, running a hand through his hair. His face was pale, his expression a mix of disbelief and hurt. You cheated on me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just heard. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The look on his face, it was like I had shattered him. And in that moment I hated myself more than I ever thought possible. "How?" Mark's voice cracked, and he shook his head, his eyes filling with pain. "How could you do this? How could you do this to us?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," I said, my voice shaking. "I swear it wasn't planned. It was a mistake, Mark. A horrible, stupid mistake. I'm so sorry. Mark held up a hand, cutting me off. His face was a mask of pain and anger now. His jaw clenched tight. Don't. Just don't. I bit my lip, my heart breaking as I watched the man I loved, the man I had betrayed, struggle to process what I had just told him. I wanted to take it all back, to undo everything, but I couldn't. The damage was done. I don't even know what to say right now, Mark said, his voice trembling with emotion. I need to think. I need to be alone. I nodded, tears streaming down my face as he turned and walked out of the room without another word. I listened to the sound of his footsteps as they faded down the hall, and then the door to our bedroom clicked shut. And just like that, the silence returned, more oppressive than ever. I sat there at the kitchen table, staring at the empty space where Mark had just been. The reality of what I had done, of what I had lost, crashed down on me, and I felt like I was drowning in it. I had broken the trust of the man I loved, shattered our marriage, and there was no way to undo it. I didn't know what was going to happen next. Would Mark ever forgive me? Could he? Or had I destroyed everything beyond repair? I sat there in the dark, my hands trembling, and for the first time since this all began, I truly realized the gravity of what I had done, and it terrified me.